Hey guys, welcome back. So now, after years and years and years of wondering what Doomsday Clock was all about, and from the time of the first announcement through the first issue all the way up to now, as readers we've gone through many birthdays and just a lot in general, because Doomsday Clock issue number 1, it was like November of 2017. But either way, we're here, we finally have a conclusion, and with that I want to get into not just what happened, but also what this may mean in the grand scope to the DC multiverse, the metaverse, and really what Dr. Manhattan has learned through it all. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so one of the biggest things that I think of, like just going into this, and it's really much of what we've seen throughout the first 11 issues, with this huge comparison between the DC universe and the Watchmen universe, to where much of your Watchmen universe centers around Dr. Manhattan, who's like your all-powerful being who did nothing for the people, but then in your DC universe, much of the influence points back to Superman, who's your symbol of hope, who always believes that there's a way, and if something can be done, that it needs to be done, regardless of who you are or how powerful you are. But even with this, in the case of Superman, when things went sideways like in Russia in the Firestorm incident, Superman was still very much to blame in the eyes of the public, to whom many of which latched onto the Superman theory, which already had many believing that the arrival of Superman is what birthed superheroes in the US, with theoretically the government creating metahumans soon after. And this is the part that was capitalized on by Ozymandias once Superman went to Russia to help Firestorm, and at the time Superman did help Firestorm find a solution, but with Ozymandias using Bubastis to create an explosion, which of course had a similar signature to Dr. Manhattan, this then sent all the heroes to Mars, to where they all went and got their butts kicked royally. But even still, with all of this, like, these were factors that were more or less locked in, if you will, to the meeting between Superman and Dr. Manhattan, because much like back when Dr. Manhattan was John Osterman and he was locked inside the intrinsic field generator, there was nothing Janny could do, and his colleagues were like, the program is locked in, and they couldn't get him out because it was a safety feature, which is something I'll talk about more in just a minute when Dr. Manhattan and Superman actually come face to face. But for now, just keep in mind that in this moment, John Osterman, who had been locked inside this intrinsic field generator, he's literally been given a clock counting down to the second, which seems to be at this point in time the moment of his death. And for John Osterman, it wasn't until that clock expired to where for him everything changed, and as we know in his case, he was torn apart, had to bring himself back together, and essentially that Doomsday Clock had counted down to the birth of Dr. Manhattan. And once it began, it was something that was locked in, and in that chamber he was in a place where no one could pull him out of, or no one could stop the clock and change the outcome once it began. And so essentially in the Doomsday Clock event, it was like metaphorically this whole thing happening all over again. And even with Ozymandias creating the attack in Russia, which essentially isolated Superman here on Earth, with him recovering from the explosion at the same time that many of the other heroes had left for Mars, but this then also lined up Superman in a place where he needed to be at the time that he needed to be there. Even with much of the world turning against him, in Russia and Kondak vying for the opportunity of who's gonna make Superman pay, and in the case of Black Adam, it was more so him taking the opportunity to pull the metahumans away from following the governments and bring them to Kondak, with all the while making an example out of Superman and likely taking those who many had believed to be his followers in the process. But even still, it's these many factors and these conflicts which funnel Superman to meet face to face with Dr. Manhattan, which is nothing that Superman could have foreseen or predicted. And in the case of Dr. Manhattan, because of his curiosity and his sight which reaches across time like one canvas, but essentially stops here, he couldn't help but always think of this moment, which is a moment of which he had to know the outcome. And it's that very curiosity that has drawn Manhattan here like a moth to a flame, which in many cases means the destruction of that moth, which I believe we talked about like in the last video. But essentially this is the same thing that brings Dr. Manhattan here, and he's curious to know because he can't see past this point, or more specifically 12 minutes after this point, if it ends with Superman destroying him or Dr. Manhattan destroying everything. And it eventually brings him to a very interesting revelation, because essentially when Superman arrives, Dr. Manhattan realizes that from his arrival in the DC universe to where he's shifted different things, almost like this huge experiment where he's attempted to understand either the natures of this multiverse or the natures of this Superman, and he equates the meeting of them two here almost as if he was a virus entering this universe and Superman was the antivirus that he would eventually come across. And so now from here, I'm gonna focus on Superman for a bit because there's a lot going on with him Atom and a couple others as well, and then we'll get right back to Dr. Manhattan. Because at this point in time, with meeting Dr. Manhattan and Superman essentially getting jumped right after by Black Adam and a group of the Russian superheroes who are seeking revenge for the Firestorm incident, but you also have a number of other metas who showed up from Israel, from Australia, and it just turns into this huge mess, to where in the middle of which Superman is there, but you can't even see him. But like the purpose of many of these guys showing up, like from Israel, their prime minister called them over there in order to force Black Adam to go back to Kahndaq. But then you also have Australia, who's teamed up with those who are still under orders from the Russian prime minister, who claims that he sent in his knights to protect America's interests, and these interests weren't made specific by the Russian prime minister. So in the broad scope, you pretty much got this all-out battle, to where in the center, the symbol of hope is nowhere to be seen, which visually was just brilliant. And so now while this is happening, at the same time, we jump over to Reggie, who essentially has a lot going on, because on one hand, he's attacked by this dude who's pretty much profiling him, accusing him of breaking into his store, and with doing so, he gives Reggie a nasty blow to the head, but fortunately Alfred shows up and makes the dude bop himself in the face. Like, why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself? But so now the reason that Alfred is here is so that he can get Reggie's help so they can track down Ozymandias. But at this point, Reggie's dealing with the whole idea of Walter Korvac not being who he believed him to be after learning the truth of Walter Korvac with him manipulating his father and ultimately leading his father to his death. And on top of that, the issue of Reggie being lied to by Mothman, who had led him to believe that his father was getting through to Walter Korvac rather than the truth of his father's mind being manipulated. And not long after this, Batman shows up, but it's really like this whole moment where we get this intervention for Reggie, which essentially is like a parallel comparison to what Superman is going through. And to me personally, it's like Doomsday Clock is just full of all these hidden messages. Because with Reggie, who feels like he's alone and he feels like fighting and looking for Ozymandias won't help, but in the case of Superman, who actually is alone and in a situation where it seems like fighting won't help, he's still fighting. And when Alfred asks Reggie to look at the Rorschach mask to tell him what he sees, and he responds like just rocks floating in space, which in other words could be interpreted as destruction and hopelessness, which is what it seems like everything is heading towards. But in the case of Superman, though this is how it seems, he's still looking. Superman is still looking for a way, even though it seems like there's no way at all. And although Batman arrives here to essentially apologize for tricking Reggie and locking him up, because initially he had just thought Reggie was crazy this whole time, but essentially it's like this whole conversation just goes to show us that there's an active working factor here that is very different from the Watchmen universe. And one of the best examples that happens here with Superman while Dr. Manhattan is just standing there and more or less just waiting for another 4 minutes for everything to come down to that moment of truth. But during this time, a car is just tossed towards this defenseless mother and child, and when this happens, Superman catches the car, which seems like nothing, but it's very important because when Dr. Manhattan had visited Superman in 1938, which was his first appearance revealing himself to the world as Superman, he had also discovered that it was here with Superman where the entire multiverse had centered around, and he had related it to like branches coming from a tree. And from what Dr. Manhattan explains, it wasn't like Superman catching a car caused this, but rather on that Earth, with Superman being the first superhero, and a decade later that world would then have the Flash, who would be brought forth by the birth of the Speed Force, which would be the tool which would later on divide time, dividing realities and creating the multiverse, which is much different from what we've been reading with Year of the Villain and Perpetua and all that. And it's really like that history that Dr. Manhattan had seen. Its accuracy is much more closer to the debut of Superman within Action Comics, and much of that pre-existing history was stretched forward into the first Crisis and Final Crisis and throughout the Flashpoint and New 52, which gave us a number of events which prior to Doomsday Clock, and with the exception of the Button, these had just been the history of DC Comics, to which now we're discovering that Dr. Manhattan, he had not only been there, but in addition to events like the Button, because with the Button we had seen the direct correlation with Dr. Manhattan and his presence within the DC universe. And it wasn't really till Doomsday Clock where we found out that he had been pulling and moving pieces all the way back to the first appearance of Superman, which essentially means that Dr. Manhattan has been here since Action Comics, which is crazy enough for me to try to wrap my head around. And that's only talking about the multiverse. Like, wait till we get into the metaverse, because at this point where Dr. Manhattan tells Superman that he has altered events in his life, and when he tells him this, it's like seconds away from that moment of truth, to where after that point everything goes dark, and for all Dr. Manhattan knows, he's about to get punched into a different publishing company and wake up on the cover of Dark Horse Comics in 1996. But it's here where he risks his whole face to see the true answers which are hidden behind this shroud of darkness in this long history of what happens next, to where in this moment he comes to find out that Superman chooses not to attack him, but rather to defend him instead. And so when Superman does this, and shortly after, Dr. Manhattan is like, well, I still see the darkness coming, but this doesn't stop anything. And it's here where Superman asks Dr. Manhattan about these photographs that he keeps manifesting everywhere he goes. And with Superman asking, like, who are the people in this picture? Like, are they important to you? And on top of that, suggesting that perhaps it will take everything from Dr. Manhattan in order to save these people and even save his old world. And it's just like that, in that moment, that Dr. Manhattan understands what he must do. And so now bear with me while I give you my interpretation of what is about to happen here. Because at this point, with Dr. Manhattan, who pretty much just lifts his hands and says, everything ends. When he does this, rather than him talking about the actual universe or the multiverse, more specifically when he says this, it's like he's pertaining to the metaverse. And in this moment where Dr. Manhattan pretty much wipes and resets the metaverse, and doing so all the way back from the beginning of time. And with doing this, he's not necessarily making an alteration to the multiverse itself, but it's almost as if we're just readjusting the metaverse within the DC multiverse. And with doing so, beginning everything with Superman, this will then cause the multiverse to align with the metaverse, with the metaverse originally being the heroes who were born and inspired after the first appearance of Superman in 1938. But it's like from here, Dr. Manhattan has changed that. So this new rebirth, if you will, by having Superman arrive at some point in every reality, almost like a safety mechanism of hope, this now creates a domino effect that will cascade throughout time, which will eventually roll through the multiverse as we know it, all the way up to the present day in the very moment that Dr. Manhattan had did this, and even further on into the future. And even with doing this, like, the effects are going to erase Dr. Manhattan from existence, but only after seeing this new metaverse which inspired him to do so. And with this inspiration, we then see Dr. Manhattan take action. So like in 1940, where he had moved the lantern from Alan Scott, the current Dr. Manhattan moved it back. And for the Clark Kent who we had seen have nightmares before, with his parents dying in an accident, who we now find out was supposed to be Superboy, but now with Dr. Manhattan changing everything back, and Jonathan and Martha Kent encouraging him to share his gifts with the world, he becomes Superboy as he's supposed to, and he saves his parents from dying in that accident that night. And prior to this point, like, this was one of those experiments which Dr. Manhattan had tried, and very cold-heartedly as he would express, but he had did this for the same reason he had moved the lantern from Alan Scott. But now with him going back and making these corrections, Alan Scott still becomes the Green Lantern, which leads to us still getting the Justice Society, Superboy still exists, and we still get the future Legion of Superheroes. But essentially with this meeting between Superman and Dr. Manhattan, and Dr. Manhattan admitting that he had interfered with Superman's life, and more or less orchestrated the death and destruction of many, whether it was through Dr. Oz, Superman's father, the death of Alan Scott, or Martha or Jonathan Kent, like, Dr. Manhattan had did all of this just to see what would happen. But in this moment where he meets with Superman in the 12th hour of the Doomsday Clock, when Dr. Manhattan confesses his sins, as he would say, and tells Superman everything that he's done, Superman still saves him. And not that he really needed to save him, you know, but it's the principalities in this. But with Superman saving Dr. Manhattan, he's inspired, and he takes that inspiration and he centers the metaverse around it, because the metaverse predates the Speed Force, predates the multiverse. So with Dr. Manhattan doing this and reforming the metaverse, which essentially is the birth and connection of all superheroes, which once again predates everything with the first appearance of Superman. And when this happens, even present day Ozymandias sees as the metaverse reforms, the timeline then catches up. And along with the timeline, so comes the multiverse, so on and so forth. Because once again, the metaverse predates everything. So for that reason, from there, it then begins a cascading effect. And I gotta say, like, this part specifically just makes me think of like the art for DC Rebirth as a whole. Because the ending for Doomsday Clock has been in our face this whole time, and we just didn't know what was going on. And even still, like, it's still mind-blowing. And I'm sure some people are gonna be like, okay, well, did Dr. Manhattan just create DC Rebirth? And I'm not gonna front, like, as far as I'm concerned, I'm gonna say yes, and only because those are Dr. Manhattan's words and not mine. Because when he gives us the breakdown of the birth of the Speed Force and the beginning of the multiverse and the crisis events, and even how Earth 1 has now become Earth 1985, which was a pretty crucial year in the Watchmen universe. But even along with this happening, Dr. Manhattan even tells us that with every change in the metaverse, the multiverse grows. And though more will be created over the years, one was created because of his interference, which is something that Dr. Manhattan goes on to describe as this rebirth. And as it appears, this is the only one that he's fully responsible for. And once again, those being his words and not mine. But as far as the effects that we see this take hold for the future, we're given a slate that reaches all the way through the year 2965. And the slate that we're given, which includes crises that the metaverse has never seen before, which is something that'll be caused by the Time Masters, like some of this could already be unfolding through the current issues of DC Rebirth. And like from the sound of it, there's a lot of crazy stuff around the corner, like even in the year 2030, with Superman fighting Thor, and then being saved by a green behemoth. And like, I know DC Comics has its own Thor, but even still, at the same time, it kind of feels like a tease for another Amalgam universe, which was a different 12-issue series which we got back in the mid-90s. But as far as getting back into how things are realigning in the current day, when we go back to Ozymandias, we find out that Saturn Girl has been restored because now Superman remembers her. And Johnny Thunder, he remembers his history, the genie, becoming the Thunderbolt, and just like that, his past and his powers are restored, which still keeps them in this present time because of the things that transpired within the timeline, but because of the alterations in the metaverse, a few others come tagging along. And so at this point, in a very Avengers Endgame kind of way, Saturn Girl shows up to Superman in a very Falcon on your left kind of moment, and we also find that she brings along with her the whole legion of superheroes, along with the Justice Society of America, which at least to me feels very much like an Avengers Endgame moment. And it's not a bad thing, it's just the vibe that I caught when I seen it. But so now from here, kind of getting into where everything else concludes as far as Ozymandias, who's eventually caught down by Batman and Reggie. Hey, Batman and Reggie kind of got a ring to it. Like the new adventures of Batman and Reggie. Okay, I'm playing, but I do like the name. But not long after they arrive here, Ozymandias, Bubastis, Reggie, the comedian, Marionette, and Mime, they're all pulled away by Dr. Manhattan, and this is the moment that gave me the idea to relate Dr. Manhattan's situation to the intrinsic field generator. Because Ozymandias, who's notorious for doing the same trick over and over again, and even doing so in the case of Bubastis, placing him in the IF generator so that Bubastis would share the similar powers of Dr. Manhattan, but in this case, Ozymandias pretty much manipulated only the factors which he was able to in an attempt to save his own world and make Superman the new Bubastis, with Ozymandias hoping not so much to give Superman the powers of Dr. Manhattan, but rather since Dr. Manhattan wouldn't save their own world, Ozymandias had hoped that he would at least be able to manipulate Superman to find a way to do this instead. And in the conclusion of all this, it actually worked. And I wouldn't so much give credit to Ozymandias because I feel like Dr. Manhattan would have figured this out eventually. And at the end of the day, it's the inspiration of Superman which caused Dr. Manhattan to reshape the metaverse. But so from here, Ozymandias does something he's pretty much famous for, and that's catching a bullet. Because after trying to take the credit for everything and be like, okay, everything's good, let's go home, the comedian just shoots him. And I would really expect no less from the irony of the comedian. But in this case, the funnier comedian was actually Lex Luthor, who reverses the frequency which brought the comedian here, sending him back to the exact moment in 1985 where Ozymandias had thrown him out the window. And it would have been nice if the Joker had done this, but Lex Luthor got the last laugh this day. And so now for Ozymandias, when Reggie tells him that like you're not gonna bleed out and die, like you're gonna go to jail and you're gonna pay for these crimes. But for me, like when this happens and Reggie takes off the mask and Ozymandias sees his face, it felt like that moment in White Chicks where Terry Crews got shot. Because Ozymandias was like, you're not Rorschach. The deception. And yeah, like that's what I thought about when I seen this. I don't know why, something wrong with me. But essentially from here, in closing, this is what Superman was talking about as far as it costing Dr. Manhattan everything, because it eventually results in John Osterman never becoming Dr. Manhattan in the Watchmen universe. Because from here, when Marionette tells Dr. Manhattan that she wants her son, Dr. Manhattan lets her know that he has greater plans for their son, which was one of the things up to this point Dr. Manhattan couldn't see when he spared their life in that bank robbery, who he would later have taken after the child was born. And so after he tells her this, a number of things happen simultaneously, because Dr. Manhattan, he can do that. Because for one, he has his last annual meeting with Carver Coleman, telling Carver that Dr. Manhattan is the one who will no longer be around, but also insisting that Carver make better decisions, which may possibly save Carver's life. But also from here, and a lot of this once again is happening simultaneously. But with us also discovering this last sequence of events, which Dr. Manhattan is doing, it is at this point where we discover he has taken the child of Marionette and Mime, which was a moment that wasn't visible to him before because of it taking place within the rebirth. And it's like for every moment that this Dr. Manhattan had interfered with something in the past, prior to this point it would seem to him like a blind spot, which is one of the main reasons I'm standing on my theory of the original Rorschach still being alive. But that's a whole nother video. I kinda did one already, I probably need to do a part 2. But sticking to the topic here, with everything that Dr. Manhattan is doing, and him taking the son of Marionette and Mime and giving him what he believes made Superman who he is, which is essentially raising him with love, very similar to how Clark was raised by Jonathan and Martha, so that this child would be prepared for his final gift. But along with this, at the same time, with Dr. Manhattan going back to the Watchmen universe, and it's crazy because all this is happening simultaneously. But with Dr. Manhattan going back to the Watchmen universe, he then influences his father to teach him at a younger age to be more concerned about the future rather than the present, which causes a domino effect for himself all the way to 1959, to where when he forgets Jenny's watch inside the IF generator, he doesn't leave lunch to go get it, which means he never gets locked inside, he never becomes Dr. Manhattan. 6 months later, him and Jenny are married, and throughout like 7 years later, they have 2 daughters and a son, which essentially causes the Dr. Manhattan who arrived in 1992, just after Ozymandias got shot. But here in the Watchmen universe, Dr. Manhattan ceases to exist as the results of his changes then save his home world. But even with this happening, this doesn't necessarily mean the end of Dr. Manhattan. And I mean, like, in a literal sense it does, because he just undid himself. But it's here that we find out one of the last acts of Dr. Manhattan through that simultaneous montage undoing himself while raising a child with love and hope. But so from here, when we jump over to Silk Spectre and Night Owl, who at this point have been raising the younger daughter of Marionette and Mime, and I gotta say, I love that all the clocks here are saying 1 o'clock, because like we're in the aftermath of the Doomsday clock. Like, I just had to put that in there. But the thing is, when we jump back here, we also get the arrival of the older son of Marionette and Mime, whom Dr. Manhattan has raised with love and pretty much with the Superman template, of whom he also names Clark. But with doing this, he gives this upbringing and this lifestyle and all of his power to Clark, so that now the Watchmen universe, they now have a protector who will receive love and return it. And it's like from this point forward, the Watchmen universe has their own Superman with the powers of Dr. Manhattan. And really anything is possible from this point. Like, he could bring back John because he misses the man who raised him. Like, anything could happen from here. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Like, I had to take my time with this one because there was just so much going on. And also in what I would say is truly like the most unexpected ending that I've ever came across in the series. Well, let me know your guys' thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.